It was late 1944. The Pacific War had turned brutal, unforgiving. On a humid morning near the island of Mabalacat in the Philippines, villagers looked up to see a dark blue aircraft spiraling out of the clouds, flames licking its wings, smoke trailing like a dying comet. It wasn't Japanese. Its silhouette was unfamiliar, long nose, bent wings, and a strange, predatory grace. Moments later, it crashed deep into the jungle, the impact echoing through the humid air. Within hours, a small detachment from the Imperial Japanese Army arrived at the site. Soldiers, mechanics, and a handful of engineers from the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Their orders were clear: recover what remained of the American plane. But as they approached the wreck, the men stopped dead in their tracks. Before them lay the F4U Corsair, nearly intact, its wings twisted but unbroken, its fuselage sturdy, its massive radial engine glinting in the dim light. To them it looked alien, like something built by hands that understood the air differently. One engineer, Lieutenant Masaru Koyama, would later write in his diary, "We had never seen anything like it. Its power, its complexity, it was as if the enemy flew machines from another world. They carefully extracted what they could, instruments, engine components, even the hydraulic systems." Koyama's team loaded each piece onto trucks under the fading light, watched by weary soldiers who had lost too many friends to American aircraft. To most, it was just another wreck. To Koyama and his colleagues, it was a message from the future. In that battered fuselage lay a symbol of everything Japan now faced. A war not just of men, but of machines. A race Japan was losing, one engine, one innovation at a time. That night, under a sweltering tent, Koyama began sketching the Corsair's strange curves by lamplight. He didn't know it yet, but what his team discovered inside that plane would shake Japan's faith in its own industry, and mark the beginning of an uncomfortable truth: that the empire of the rising sun was falling behind, faster than anyone dared to admit. Japanese engineers captured an F4U Corsair, then admitted they never seen anything like it. To understand the engineers' astonishment that day, we must go back to where the Corsair was born, not in battle, but in innovation. It began in 1938, in a modest Connecticut workshop at Vought Aircraft. American designers were chasing an impossible dream, a fighter fast enough to outrun anything in the sky, yet strong enough to survive brutal carrier landings. When they unveiled the prototype, even the Navy was stunned. The aircraft's wings bent sharply downward before rising again, the now iconic gull wing design. It looked unconventional, almost ugly. But its purpose was pure genius. The bent wings allowed the Corsair to fit a massive engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders, delivering more than 2,000 horsepower. Its huge propeller demanded long landing gear, and the wing's shape allowed engineers to shorten that gear, giving it strength and clearance at once. When the F4U first took flight, test pilots called it a monster with wings. It climbed faster, hit harder, and flew higher than any fighter before it. The first time it exceeded 400 miles per hour, it broke not just records, but expectations. By 1943, when it reached the Pacific, the Corsair was more than a plane. It was a statement that American industry, once underestimated, could now outproduce and outthink its rivals. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Japan's own engineers fought a different war. The Zero, agile, elegant, deadly, had once ruled the skies. But by 1944, its dominance was fading. Japan's aircraft were masterpieces of lightness and maneuverability, but built with fragile aluminum, limited armor, and underpowered engines. They were designed for short victories, not long wars. The island nation's industrial base strained under shortages. Fuel was scarce. Rubber, steel, even high-octane gasoline, all rationed or lost to Allied blockades. The Zero could turn tighter than any American plane, but it couldn't outrun them anymore. The Corsair, the Hellcat, and the Thunderbolt, they all carried the one advantage: Japan could no longer match power. For every fighter Japan built, America built 10. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained hundreds. And for every ton of steel Japan could forge, America could forge 100 more. So when that Corsair fell from the sky and into Japanese hands, it was more than a wreck, it was a revelation. The engineers who stood over its fuselage weren't just examining a machine, they were staring at the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, one Japan could no longer hope to win by skill alone. And in that realization, the story of the captured Corsair truly begins. As Koyama's team began their first inspection, they couldn't have known that the answers they sought would only deepen their unease. What they found inside that blue machine would challenge everything they thought they understood about flight itself. War isn't just fought by armies. It's fought by hands, by men hunched over engines, by fingers that tremble from exhaustion, by eyes that refuse to blink through the smoke. In the village workshop near Mabalacat, a team of 6 Japanese engineers worked in near silence. They were not soldiers, yet they carried a soldier's burden to understand the enemy's machine before it destroyed more of their own. The team was led by Lieutenant Masaru Koyama, a 30-year-old aeronautical engineer from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Before the war, he had studied glider design, fascinated by the purity of flight. Now his days were consumed by the dissection of American aircraft, cold, mechanical autopsies of enemy genius. He had seen captured P-40 Se, a few wrecked B-25 Se, and once, a mangled Hellcat. But never anything like the Corsair. Every bolt, every hydraulic line spoke of precision. The wiring was labeled in English. The materials were unfamiliar. Alloys so advanced Japan hadn't yet produced them. Even the rivets, perfectly machined and sealed, resisted the island's humidity. Koyama SIP's assistant, Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka, whispered that night, "If our planes had this engine, sir, maybe the war would be different." Koyama didn't set answer. He just stared at the Corsair's massive propeller, bent but unbroken, and thought of what that meant. And on the other side of the Pacific, there was another man, Lieutenant Robert Bobby Hayes, the American pilot who had once flown that very Corsair, 22 years old, a Marine aviator from Kansas. On that morning, he had taken off from the deck of the USS Bunker Hill, part of a raid over Luzon. Enemy flak caught his right wing. He tried to make it back over the sea, but the Corsair, bleeding oil and power, refused. His last radio transmission crackled through static. "Shisei's going down. Tell the boys to keep pushing. Find a way." No one ever heard from him again. The Japanese soldiers who recovered the wreck found no body. Only a torn flight jacket, a crushed radio, and a single bullet hole in the canopy. Perhaps Hayes died on impact. Perhaps he survived wandering into the jungle, one more ghost of the Pacific War. To Koyama, that mystery lingered like a shadow. Each night, as he examined the Corsair's inner workings, he wondered about the man who had built faith into this machine, the man who had trusted it to bring him home. It was a strange connection, enemy to enemy, engineer to pilot. Both men had lived for the same dream, to master the sky. But only one side had the means to make that dream real. As Koyama SIP's team prepared their full report to Tokyo, the question grew louder in every man SIP's mind. Could Japan ever match this? And if they couldn't, what did it mean for the empire's future? The answer would arrive soon, but not the one they hoped for. For 3 days, the jungle echoed not with gunfire, but with tools. Lieutenant Koyama's team had turned their small camp into a laboratory. Under torn camouflage netting, they laid the Corsair bare, stripping its skin, cataloguing its organs. Every part told a story. The engine, a monstrous Pratt and Whitney R2800, nearly twice the size of the Zeros. Its cylinders cast with an alloy no one in Japan had seen. The cooling fins perfectly uniform, cut by machines that didn't exist on their side of the Pacific. Estimated output, 2,000 horsepower, supercharger intact, double-stage compression. He hesitated, looking at Koyama. "Sir, that SIP's impossible." Koyama didn't reply. He simply noted the figures and continued. The Corsair's fuselage was layered with innovations, automatic flaps, bullet-resistant glass, self-sealing fuel tanks. It was built to endure punishment. Everywhere they looked, they found signs of a nation whose factories had turned science into art, and art into war. When Koyama examined the landing gear assembly, he stopped cold. Its hydraulic system was compact, smooth, almost delicate. The steel pistons moved with a whisper, balanced perfectly, as if polished by wind. "Even our best machinists couldn't make this fit," he murmured. Back in the US, factories in Connecticut, Ohio, and California produced hundreds of Corsairs every month. Women and men, many of whom had never seen an airplane before, assembled precision parts in endless lines. American industry had learned something Japan had not, that power came not just from ingenuity, but from scale. Meanwhile, Japan's engineers worked with rationed materials, often by hand, reusing parts from wrecks just to keep test planes flying. Their prototypes, like the N1K Shuden or the J2M Raiden, were miracles of craftsmanship, but miracles could not win wars against assembly lines. Each new discovery inside the Corsair brought admiration and despair. By the fourth night, Koyama's men spoke in whispers. What they were learning was not just technical. It was existential. "If they can build one of these every day," said Tanaka, "then no matter how well we fly, we are already defeated." Koyama looked at him, eyes weary, and said quietly, "Then our duty is to understand why, even if we cannot match it." That was the turning point. What began as curiosity became obsession. The engineers no longer worked for orders. They worked to confront a haunting question. How could one nation soar so high, while another, with equal will and courage, struggled to keep its wings from breaking? As the rain hammered the tin roofs and lightning split the sky, the Corsair lay half dissected on the ground, its blue skin gleaming under flashes of light. To the men who studied it, it was no longer just a plane. It was a mirror, reflecting everything Japan feared it had become brilliant but outmatched. By early 1945, as the war closed in from all sides, Koyama's report reached the Naval Technical Department in Yokosuka. It was a thick folder of notes, sketches, and quiet revelations, part admiration, part obituary for Japan's hopes in the air. Inside were the engineers' findings. The Corsair's R2800 engine delivered nearly twice the horsepower of Japan's best Nakajima Homare. Its fuel injection was automatic. Its cooling system, efficient. Its structure, reinforced with alloys the Empire could no longer produce. At the bottom of the final page, Koyama had written one line in his careful handwriting: "This design cannot be reproduced with our current technology." By then, Japan's ships factories were starving. Aluminum was scarce. Oil nearly gone. Even rubber for tires was replaced with bamboo and resin. In Nagoya, engineers melted down old Zero airframes for scrap metal. In Yokosuka, students were taught to carve propeller molds from wood. Tokyo's once proud aircraft works now stood dark, their power cut by Allied bombing raids that came almost nightly. And above it all, the skies once ruled by the rising sun were now dominated by engines like the one Koyama had studied, roaring, relentless, unstoppable. The day Koyama's report arrived in Tokyo, American B-29s appeared over the city. Engines thundered above the clouds, the sound of inevitability. Koyama and Tanaka huddled in a bunker as explosions shook the ground. The earth trembled. Dust fell like ash. Tanaka turned to him, voice low. "Sir, do you think they built this Corsair so well because they knew they could lose?" Koyama looked up through the smoke. "No," he said softly. "They built it so they wouldn't stet." The war had become a nightmare of contrasts. One nation building faster than the other could destroy, the other fighting with courage that no longer had tools to match it. Back in the jungle, the wreck of the Corsair still lay where it had fallen, scavenged, stripped, and silent. Its broken wings were now a shelter for soldiers, its metal melted into parts for Japan's dwindling air fleet. But its meaning endured. For Koyama, the Corsair had become more than a machine. It was a confession written in steel. A revelation that the Empire Sep's dreams of invincibility were not just fading, They had already vanished. And yet, amid that despair, one thought refused to die. If they couldn't match the Corsair, maybe they could learn from it. That fragile hope would lead Koyama to one final gamble, one last attempt to bridge the unbridgeable gap. Tokyo was burning, the empire crumbling, yet in a small workshop south of Yokosuka, a handful of engineers refused to surrender to despair. Lieutenant Masaru Koyama sat over his sketches of the Corsair, tracing every curve from memory. The reports were clear. Japan could not replicate the American design. But Koyama wasn't set trying to copy it anymore. He was trying to understand it. There was one part of the Corsair that fascinated him more than any other, its engine and airflow harmony. Unlike Japanese fighters, whose engines often overheated and lost power in climbs, the Corsair's cooling system seemed alive. The cowling, ducts and supercharger worked in perfect symphony. It wasn't brute power, it was engineering elegance. Koyama gathered his team, Tanaka and 3 young apprentices barely in their 20s. Their faces were drawn, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and hunger. Outside, the air smelled of smoke and iron dust. He pointed to the diagram pinned on the wall. "We cannot build their engine," he said, "but we can learn its rhythm. Maybe, just maybe, we can make our machines breathe again." And so began their secret project, unofficial, unsanctioned, and born from quiet defiance. They called it Kaze no Kokoro, Heart of the Wind. It was not a plane but a concept, a hybrid design, inspired by the Corsair's aerodynamics but scaled for Japan's lighter engines. They scavenged parts from wrecks, used scrap aluminum, even melted down canteens for experimental molds. Every night they worked by candlelight as Allied bombers thundered overhead. Each explosion shook dust from the rafters, but they kept drawing. They knew the war was lost, yet this, in some unspoken way, was their act of resistance. One evening, after weeks of labor, they managed to fit an experimental cooling ring onto an old Nakajima engine. Tanaka turned the crank. The engine coughed, spat smoke, then roared to life for 5 fleeting seconds. The men froze, staring at it like children witnessing a miracle. Then it died, hissing steam. 5 seconds, Tanaka said, smiling weakly, but it breathed. Koyama nodded, eyes glistening. And that means we still can. It would never fly. The war would end before Kaze no Kokoro even left the ground. But in that dim workshop, among the ruins of an empire, something more important than victory took form: understanding. The Corsair had not just humbled Japan's engineers. It had awakened them. It showed them what precision, patience and purpose could build when resources alone weren't enough. In the language of war, this was no triumph. But in the language of humanity, it was the sound of hope refusing to die. And as the night carried on, Koyama looked at the dark horizon and whispered to no one in particular. "Someday, we still build our own wings, and they still be worthy of the sky." By the spring of 1945, Japan was a nation running on memory. Cities smoldered, factories stood silent. And in a quiet corner of Yokosuka, Lieutenant Koyama's team worked as if time itself could be defied. They had no formal approval, no funding, and barely any materials left. Yet, piece by piece, they began to shape something that resembled an aircraft's heart, not for flight, but for understanding. On a wooden bench lay the fragments of the Corsair's engine cowling, warped but sacred. Every line, every vent, every curve was a clue. Beside it, Japanese parts, crude, handmade but crafted with reverence. Their mission had shifted. They no longer dreamed of producing a fighter to rival the Corsair. Now their goal was simpler: to record everything they learned before the inevitable end came. Blueprints, notes, test results. A record of humility and hope in the face of ruin. They called their experiment Kaze no Kokoro Mark II, Heart of the Wind, Second Breath. A small engine test bed, built entirely from recycled parts. Tanaka ran the numbers on a chalkboard, his handwriting shaky. "If we can stabilize the airflow, we could reduce overheating by 15%. Koyama smiled faintly. "That one that win the war," he said. Tanaka replied, "But maybe it will help the next one." That next one was closer than they imagined, not a future war, but a war of endurance, survival, and memory. The night of March 9th, 1945, Tokyo burned. Firestorms swallowed the city. Over 100,000 civilians perished in a single night. From their workshop, Koyama's team watched the horizon glow red, the wind carrying ash like snow. They knew it was only a matter of time before Yokosuka too was consumed. Koyama gathered his men. "Tomorrow, we finish the tests. Then we hide the blueprints." The next day, they worked in silence. Engines sputtered, coughed, came alive. They recorded temperatures, pressures, air intake readings, as if every number could preserve a sliver of dignity. When the final test ended, Koyama wrapped the papers in oilcloth and sealed them inside a steel toolbox. He buried it beneath a cherry tree outside the workshop. "Someday," he said, "someone will find this, and they still understand what we tried to do." That act, quiet, unseen, was more than a gesture of defiance. It was a statement that knowledge mattered, even in defeat. That innovation, even in ruins, was still sacred. And in those final weeks before surrender, Japan's engineers, not warriors, but thinkers, fought their own invisible battle. To leave behind something better than what they had received. They couldn't change the war. But perhaps, in some distant tomorrow, they could help shape the peace. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's voice echoed through every radio in Japan, trembling, distant and final. "We have resolved to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable." And in the workshop at Yokosuka, the men froze. For a moment, even the rain seemed to stop. Lieutenant Koyama turned off the lights. The Corsair fragments, the metal, the notes, the blueprints, glimmered faintly in the half-light, like ghosts of the machines they once were. "It fets over," Tanaka whispered. Koyama said nothing. He walked to the buried toolbox beneath the cherry tree, brushed the wet earth with his hand, and bowed his head. Not to a flag, not to an emperor, but to the idea of learning. In the weeks that followed, the Allied occupation began. American engineers, fluent in precision and suspicion, scoured Japan's laboratories. They searched for blueprints, for aircraft, for any surviving prototypes. And when they reached Yokosuka, they found the remains of the Corsair's shell. One of the investigators, a U.S. Navy engineer named Lieutenant Frank Olson, paused, studying the fragments with curiosity. "Who worked on this?" he asked through an interpreter. Koyama stepped forward, his uniform stripped of insignia, his tone humble but clear. "I did," he said. "We studied it. We tried to understand it, not to copy, but to learn." Olson looked at him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You learned well," he said. "This machine took us years to perfect." In an unexpected turn, Olson's team didn't destroy Koyama's work. Instead, they asked him to explain his notes. Day by day, the two engineers, once enemies, stood side by side, tracing the lines of an American machine and the Japanese annotations that now surrounded it. Olson was impressed. "You saw things most of my men wouldn't have noticed," he admitted. Koyama smiled faintly. "War teaches fast." The Corsair, once a symbol of destruction, became, in that hangar, a shared language of progress. It was the ultimate reversal. The weapon that once killed men on both sides became a bridge between them. Koyama and his surviving team were later invited to assist in Japan's post-war aeronautical rebuilding efforts under strict US supervision. They never built another warplane, but their work, their precision, their humility, quietly shaped Japan's post-war engineering philosophy. And decades later, when Japan began producing some of the most advanced civilian aircraft components in the world, a retired engineer told his students, "Our lessons began with an American plane that fell into our hands, and taught us not how to fight, but how to think." The Corsair never flew again, but its story did. From the ashes of defeat came understanding, and from understanding, a new kind of victory. Because sometimes the most powerful engines are not those that roar in war, but those that drive men to build peace. 2 decades passed. The scars of war had faded, at least on the surface. Tokyo gleamed with new towers. Bullet trains glided where once bombs fell. And in a quiet corner of Yokosuka, a small team of local university students were clearing ground for a new building. One of them, a young engineer named Hiroshi Koyama, noticed something glinting in the soil. A small rusted box, its hinges corroded, its sides marked with faint, almost forgotten kanji. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth yellowed with age, lay sheets of blue paper covered in meticulous drawings, airflow lines, curves, pressure notes. At the bottom, a faded name. Hiroshi Koyama, IJN Engineering Corps, 1945. It was his grandfather Fitz handwriting. The man he'd grown up hearing about, only in fragments, a quiet engineer who worked on airplanes during the war. Hiroshi held the papers like sacred relics. To him, they weren't military secrets or trophies. They were a bridge across time, proof that even in defeat, his grandfather had chosen creation over destruction. In 1965, those rediscovered blueprints were quietly donated to the National Museum of Japanese Science and Technology. Experts were astonished. They showed aerodynamic calculations nearly identical to those used in Western jet design only years later. Equations that Koyama's team had reached independently, under siege, without computers, without resources, driven only by curiosity and respect for the craft. This is not the work of a defeated nation, one historian said. It is the work of minds that refused to surrender. By the 1970s, Japan's aviation industry had re-emerged, not as a builder of warplanes, but as a contributor to global aerospace projects. Lightweight alloys, precision turbines, advanced manufacturing, all hallmarks of a nation that had learned from its mistakes and from its enemies. And in a small ceremony, a photograph of Lieutenant Koyama was placed beside a restored F4U Corsair at a US museum exhibit titled Warriors and Engineers, the Machines That Brought Us Together. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Captured in war, understood in peace." The Corsair, once feared as a weapon, had become a teacher, its wings stretching across generations, carrying not bombs but lessons. Hiroshi often visited that museum. He would stand beneath the Corsair's blue wings, listening to the faint hum of an engine restored to silence. And he would whisper, "You were right, grandfather. Someone did find it. Someone did understand." The war ended in flames. But out of those flames came something quieter, stronger, a belief that knowledge once born can never truly die. The F4U Corsair was more than a machine of war. It was a catalyst, a teacher that spoke across oceans, through fire and smoke to engineers and pilots, enemies and allies alike. Lieutenant Koyama and his team discovered that courage, ingenuity, and perseverance mattered as much as speed, armor, or firepower. In their hands, the Corsair became a mirror, reflecting not just the might of American industry, but the spirit of those who refused to yield even in defeat. And in a way, the story of the Corsair reminds us of something profound about war, technology, and humanity. Even in conflict, knowledge can bridge divides. Even in the darkest moments, understanding can survive. And even in defeat, hope, quiet, steadfast, can leave a legacy far beyond the battlefield. Today, when we look at the Corsair, its gleaming fuselage, its graceful wings, we are reminded that history is more than dates, battles, and losses. It is a story of humans striving, learning, and passing knowledge across generations. The Corsair was captured. The Corsair was dissected. But in the end, it taught a lesson no weapon ever could, that curiosity, diligence, and respect for craft endure longer than any war. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the human spirit amidst history's chaos, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of the past. Because history is not just to be remembered, it is to be felt, learned from, and passed on.